At 10:47 at night, 12 cardinals received the same message from the Apostolic Palace. His Holiness wanted to see them before midnight, and no explanation was included. One by one, they crossed the Vatican walls and entered a dim side hall where a single empty chair waited at the far end of a long table. None of them knew that Pope Leo XIV had already verified every signature, every authorization, and every decision they had made while he was away. When the door finally opened, the Pope entered alone. He carried a red folder containing 23 pages of evidence and a small black leather notebook filled with 12 handwritten names. He did not summon them to debate what had happened, and he did not need them to confess before he began. The only question left was what he intended to do now that the men who had moved against his reforms were sitting directly in front of him. 10 days before the midnight summons, Pope Leo XIV was returning from an 11-day apostolic journey across 4 African nations. He had traveled through Algeria, Cameroon, Angola, and Equatorial Guinea, moving from formal meetings into places where the church existed far from ceremony. In Bata, he entered a prison and listened as inmates prayed the Our Father while rain fell around them. In Cameroon, he met children who had walked for 4 hours simply to stand near him. By the final day, the Pope was visibly exhausted, but the journey had left something deeper than fatigue. During the last leg of the flight to Rome, a red folder was placed quietly on the private desk before him. There was no sender's name, no covering letter, and no explanation beyond a narrow label identifying it for confidential internal use. He opened it somewhere over the Mediterranean, and by the time the aircraft reached Rome, the mood around him had changed. The folder contained 23 pages and 12 names. Those names belonged to the Saint 12 cardinals who would later be called into the Apostolic Palace before midnight. The documents showed that while the Pope had been standing before crowds in Yaoundé and Luanda, decisions had been moving through the Roman Curia without his approval. By the time the wheels touched the runway, he understood that his absence had not merely been used for delay. It had been used to move against the direction of his pontificate. What had happened during those 11 days was not simple resistance. It was a coordinated effort inside the Roman Curia to slow, soften, and in some cases reverse 3 reforms that Pope Leo XIV had placed near the center of his pontificate. The changes were not announced publicly, and no official challenge was made to his authority. They were inserted through signatures, revised clauses, reassigned responsibilities, and delays buried inside administrative language that few people were expected to examine closely. The first reform concerned financial transparency. Pope Leo XIV had ordered full audits of every Vatican department before the end of the year, with records to be examined by lay financial experts brought in from outside Rome. These auditors would have no personal loyalties, institutional debts, or protective relationships inside the Vatican walls. Their task was to follow accounts, contracts, transfers, and authorizations without regard for rank or reputation. The second reform was structural. The Pope intended to reduce the influence of selected offices within the Roman Curia and transfer greater decision-making authority to bishops serving far beyond Europe. During the African journey, he had stated openly that Rome could not govern a church that had long ceased to be only Roman. While he was away, internal revisions began weakening that redistribution before it could become binding. The third reform carried the greatest institutional danger. Pope Leo XIV wanted a new accountability protocol for bishops accused of concealing abuse, with no more quiet transfers, protected retirements, or outcomes hidden from the public record. The process would be public, the records would be public, and the names of those responsible would remain attached to the final decisions. During his absence, Delays and procedural changes were inserted into that reform as well. By the time the Pope finished reading the red folder over the Mediterranean, the method was unmistakable. A signature had been added in one office, a clause had been softened in another, and a delay had been concealed inside a memorandum that appeared routine. None of the reforms had been openly rejected, but all three had been made weaker. The Pope had been outmaneuvered quietly, patiently, and professionally by men who understood how to make resistance look like procedure. Pope Leo XIV also understood the institution they were using. He had spent decades watching the Curia delay decisions, absorb pressure, exhaust popes who moved too quickly, and outlast popes who moved too slowly. He knew that confrontation without proof would allow the system to close around him. He had been pushed, but before he pushed back, he needed to know exactly who had moved, how they had done it, and who had remained silent. For the next 7 days, Pope Leo XIV said nothing about the red folder. His closest aides noticed the difference immediately because he was known for addressing problems directly rather than allowing them to remain unresolved. This time, he followed his public schedule without interruption and gave no visible sign that 12 cardinals were already under examination. The silence was not hesitation, it was control. He attended his general audiences and greeted pilgrims in St. Peter's Square with the same measured calm the public had come to expect. On April 27th, he received the Archbishop of Canterbury, Sarah Mullally, inside the Apostolic Palace. They prayed together in the Urban VIII Chapel and spoke about peace, unity, and the unarmed peace of the risen Christ. The cameras recorded a pope who appeared composed, rested, and fully occupied with the ordinary work of his office. Nothing in those public appearances revealed what was happening behind closed doors. The Pope smiled before the crowds, listened to prepared remarks, and moved through the ceremonies without allowing frustration to alter his expression. To the outside world, the African journey had ended, and the Vatican had returned to routine. Inside the Apostolic Palace, the investigation had already begun. The first person called in was the head of the Office of Statistics. The meeting appeared nowhere in the public schedule, and no witness was present when the official entered the Pope's private study. He left alone and offered no account of what had been discussed. Soon afterward, another private appointment was arranged. The second visitor was a layman who had worked with Pope Leo XIV during his years in Peru. He was not part of the Roman hierarchy and did not depend on curial relationships for his position. The Pope trusted him with his life, and that trust made him useful in a matter where institutional loyalty could not be assumed. He entered quietly, remained behind the closed door, and departed without speaking to the aides outside. The auditors personally appointed by the Pope during the previous summer were called in next. They came separately and were shown material connected to the proposed financial review, the altered authorizations, and the internal decisions made during the African journey. The Pope did not ask for general impressions. He required verification that could survive denial, procedural challenge, and internal resistance. The final private meeting in that sequence was with the prefect of the dicastery for communication. Like the others, the prefect arrived alone and left without revealing what had passed between them. By then, the Pope was no longer simply determining whether the documents were authentic. He was also measuring how the institution might react once the confrontation became unavoidable. Throughout those 7 days, no accusation was made publicly and no cardinal was warned. The 12 men named in the folder continued their duties without knowing how much the Pope had already confirmed. They signed routine documents, attended meetings, and moved through the Curia under the assumption that their actions remained concealed inside administrative procedure. Pope Leo XIV allowed that assumption to remain in place while the evidence closed around them. By the morning of April 30th, the examination of the red folder was complete. Every page had been checked against internal records, every signature had been matched, and every date had been placed against the Pope's travel schedule. The electronic messages, authorizations, and procedural movements had also been confirmed. Nothing remained that could be dismissed as misunderstanding or administrative confusion. The pattern was now clear across all 23 pages. Decisions had been taken during the Pope's 11 days in Africa, then carried through offices that did not possess sufficient authority to complete them on their own. Signatures that should have required further approval had been treated as final. Instructions personally issued by the Pope had been delayed, revised, or bypassed while he was outside Rome. One meeting proved more decisive than the others. At dawn, a retired official with decades of experience inside the Roman Curia was summoned to the Pope's private study. He arrived expecting a discussion about pastoral matters and found 3 pages waiting on the desk. Pope Leo XIV placed them before him and asked whether he had seen the same pattern before. The retired official read without speaking. The room remained still while he examined the language, the sequence of authorizations, and the timing of the decisions. When he finally looked up, his eyes had filled with tears. He told the Pope that he had seen the method many times, under 3 different popes. The official explained that the operation always followed the same design. Men inside the institution waited until a pope was tired, absent, or distracted, then moved through procedure before he could intervene. The decision would appear technical, the delay would appear temporary, and responsibility would be divided across several offices. By the time the Pope discovered what had happened, the resistance had already become part of the machinery. Pope Leo XIV then asked how the previous popes had responded. The retired official lowered his eyes toward the floor before answering. He said that they had not truly stopped it, and that this was why they had become tired. The answer did not accuse them of weakness, but it revealed the cost of allowing the pattern to continue. The Pope thanked the man and dismissed him without further discussion. After the door closed, he remained seated at his desk for a long time without moving. The documents were no longer only evidence of what 12 cardinals had done during one journey. They were proof that an old institutional method had been used again because its architects believed the result would be the same. That afternoon, Pope Leo XIV walked alone through the Vatican gardens for almost an hour. A close aide later said it was the only time he had ever seen the Pope visibly angry. There was no public outburst, no immediate order, and no change to the official schedule. The anger appeared only in the length of the walk and in the silence that followed him back inside. By nightfall, the investigation had become a decision. The Pope no longer needed more documents, more witnesses, or more time to understand what had happened. The evidence identified who initiated the operation, who agreed to it, who signed, who carried the documents forward, and who remained silent. That night, the calls began. The first call had gone out at 10:47 that night. Each cardinal received the same message in the same controlled tone, with no agenda, no subject, and no room to refuse. By 11:14, the first man had reached the Apostolic Palace from his apartment near the Vatican walls. He was elderly, slow-moving, and carried a small leather binder under his arm, even though no one had instructed him to bring documents. The second cardinal arrived 3 minutes later in a black sedan. He stepped out, crossed the entrance, and went inside without speaking to the driver. The third and fourth men arrived together from the same residence and the same dicastery. Inside the elevator, they exchanged nervous glances but said nothing. The remaining cardinals entered one by one. None of them stopped to speak in the corridor, and none attempted to discover why the others had been summoned. By 1135, all 12 had crossed the threshold of the apostolic palace. Confusion had settled into something colder as they realized the meeting had been arranged outside every normal procedure. They were not taken to the Pope's private library. An attendant led them instead into a smaller side hall that was rarely used after dark. The lights had been deliberately lowered, and a single long table stood in the center of the room. 12 chairs had been placed along one side, while one empty chair waited alone at the far end. The cardinals remained standing. No instruction had been given to sit, and none of them was willing to assume permission. For 3 minutes, no one spoke. One man adjusted his pectoral cross, while another wiped the sweat from his temple even though the room was cold. The silence became more oppressive with each passing second. Some shifted their weight, but no one approached the empty chair or asked when the Pope would arrive. They had entered the room as experienced men accustomed to controlling meetings, language, and procedure. In that hall, they had no agenda and no authority over what happened next. Then the door opened. Pope Leo XIV entered alone without an assistant, translator, camera, or note-taker. He carried only the red folder and a small black leather notebook. He placed both objects on the table beside the empty chair and looked across the 12 men before speaking. "Sit," he said. They obeyed at once. The Pope remained standing and studied each face slowly, holding every man's eyes for several seconds longer than comfort allowed. By the time his gaze reached the final cardinal, the room understood that he had not summoned a group in the abstract. He had summoned 12 specific men whose names he had already memorized. Pope Leo XIV opened the red folder and removed a single page. He held it before the 12 cardinals and asked whether any of them wanted to explain what it was. No one answered. The page remained raised between them as the silence exposed how much each man already understood. The document was an internal memorandum dated April 16th. Its central paragraph authorized a 90-day delay of the lay-led financial audit, one of the reforms the Pope had personally ordered. 4 signatures appeared beneath the text, and all 4 men were seated at the table. The decision had moved forward without the Pope's signature, consultation, or knowledge. He turned the memorandum so the cardinals could see it clearly. In a quiet voice, he told them that 3 of them had signed it and 1 of them had written it. He did not identify the author yet. The separation between those who approved the language and the man who created it placed a different weight on every face in the room. Pope Leo XIV then stated what the document had done. His financial reform had been pushed back by 3 months while he was preaching to children in Cameroon. He had not been asked, informed, or consulted before the delay was authorized in the name of the institution he governed. The contrast between the public journey and the private maneuver left no space for anyone to describe the memorandum as routine administration. He allowed another pause before continuing. The cardinals remained seated, unable to determine whether he wanted a defense, an admission, or the name of the man who had drafted the text. The Pope gave them none of those openings. He simply told them that this was only the first document. His hand returned to the red folder. 8 more pages were waiting to be presented, each connected to a separate decision made during the same 11-day absence. The first memorandum had established the method, the date, and the participants. What followed would show that the delay of the audit had not been an isolated act. Pope Leo XIV removed the second page from the red folder, then the third, the fourth, and the pages that followed. Each document recorded a separate decision made while he was traveling through Africa. None of them appeared dramatic when read alone. Together they revealed a coordinated effort to alter the direction of his government through ordinary administrative channels. One document reorganized a small office without the approval normally required for such a change. Another reassigned a financial supervisor whose position had been connected to the coming audit. A third reopened negotiations on a contract that the Pope had personally suspended 6 months earlier. The language in each document was restrained, but the effect was the same. Authority had been moved away from the reforms he had ordered. The next pages carried greater consequences. An investigation personally ordered by the Pope had been delayed, even though no new evidence justified the postponement. A travel authorization had also been issued for a bishop whom Pope Leo XIV had explicitly instructed to remain in his diocese while a review was underway. The permission had been granted through signatures that should not have been sufficient under Vatican procedure. Each decision had still been carried through. Offices received the papers, officials treated them as valid, and no one stopped the process to ask whether the Pope had approved the change. Responsibility had been divided across several desks, allowing every participant to claim that someone else had possessed the necessary authority. The document showed how institutional resistance could advance without any single man openly declaring opposition. As the Pope continued reading, the silence in the side hall grew heavier. The oldest cardinal in the room, a man approaching 80 years of age, began to tremble by the time the 8th document was presented. His hands moved slightly against the table as he tried to hold them still. No one beside him offered assistance. By the 9th document, another cardinal had begun to weep. His shoulders shook quietly beneath the dim light, but he did not raise his head or speak. The Pope did not pause to comfort him, and he did not use the reaction to increase the humiliation in the room. He continued reading in the same measured voice. Pope Leo XIV never struck the table. He never insulted the cardinals, threatened them, or raised his voice. He allowed the pages, dates, signatures, and authorizations to carry the accusation. Every new document removed another possible defense until silence became the only position left to them. When the final page had been presented, the Pope placed the folder on the table. He told them that 11 days in Africa had produced 23 pages of damage. The number was not only a measure of paperwork, it represented a complete record of how quickly the machinery of the Curia had moved once its bishop was outside Rome. He looked across the table and told the cardinals that he knew what each of them had done. He knew who had initiated the operation, who had agreed to it, who had signed without reading, and who had passed the documents forward. He also knew who had remained silent and who had instructed the others to remain silent. His voice stayed calm because the evidence no longer required force. The Pope told them that he had not summoned them for confessions, excuses, or public humiliation. He had brought them there for the truth. Yet he did not begin by asking questions, because the first part of the confrontation belonged to him. Before any man in the room was allowed to explain himself, Pope Leo XIV intended to define what their actions meant for the government of the Church. Pope Leo XIV sat down and folded his hands on the table. He spoke slowly in Italian, so that no man in the room could claim to have misunderstood him. He told them that the Church would not be governed in shadow while he remained Pope, after he was gone, or under any pontificate that followed. The statement moved beyond the documents and became a declaration about the limits of institutional power. He turned toward the eldest cardinal and reminded him that he had known Pope Francis and worked beside him. He had watched Francis attempt reform, and he had also watched parts of the Vatican slow those efforts year after year. The resistance had continued until the Pope's body, words, and even sentences carried the weight of exhaustion. Pope Leo XIV then told the room that he was not Francis and would not be tired in the same way. No one moved. The cardinals had expected accusation, punishment, or negotiation, but the Pope was defining the assumptions that had guided their actions. He told them that they had mistaken his late arrival for ignorance of the institution. They had mistaken quietness for blindness, and calmness for patience with conduct that should never have been tolerated. He looked down at the red folder before raising his eyes again. Every assumption, he told them, had been wrong. His next words were delivered without anger, but they carried more force than anything spoken earlier. The church would no longer hide behind silence, procedure, or red robes. Pope Leo XIV told them that truth was not negotiable, reform was not optional, and obedience to the See of Peter was not seasonal. The Cardinals had spent their careers inside a system where timing, rank, and procedure could soften direct authority. In that room, those protections had disappeared. For the first time that night, none of the 12 possessed a strategy, countermove, or prepared script. The Pope continued by naming the deeper failure behind the documents. For decades, men in rooms like that, one had governed the Church as though she belonged to them. They had treated wounds as inconveniences, victims as public relations problems, finances as private inheritance, and the faithful as an audience rather than the body of Christ. The words remained controlled because the accusation was institutional, not theatrical. He allowed the silence to settle before finishing the declaration. That form of governance would end in his pontificate, with him in that room on that night. He did not repeat the statement or explain it further. The meaning was already clear to every man seated before him. Then Pope Leo XIV reached for the black leather notebook. The red folder had shown what the cardinals had done. The notebook would show what the Pope had decided to do with each of them. Pope Leo XIV opened the black leather notebook and turned to a single page. 12 names had been written there in his own hand, one for each cardinal seated before him. Beside every name appeared one word. He did not read the words aloud, but slowly turned the notebook so each man could find his own line. Some names were marked warning, others were marked review or removal. Only one name carried the word trust. The cardinal beside that word did not appear relieved, because until that moment he had assumed that he belonged among the most compromised men in the room. The cardinals marked for removal went pale. 2 lowered their heads, while one closed his eyes and remained still. Those marked warning released small breaths, but the relief lasted only seconds. None of them yet understood what the warning would restrict or how closely their conduct would be watched. The notebook changed the structure of the meeting. Until that moment, the 12 men had faced the Pope as a single group connected by the same operation. Now each of them had been separated by an individual judgment that no one else fully understood. The coalition still occupied one side of the table, but it no longer existed as a unified body. Pope Leo XIV closed the notebook. He informed them that each man would receive a written decision before the end of the week. Some would remain in their positions, some would be reassigned, and others would be asked to retire. No one would leave the room knowing his complete future. The Pope then imposed silence. None of the cardinals was permitted to discuss the meeting that night, the next day, or at any point during the rest of the month. He told them that if a single line from the confrontation appeared in the press, all 12 would be reassigned immediately. There would be no trial, appeal, or exception. His voice remained level when he stated that he would not negotiate with leaks. He lifted the red folder and told them that it would remain in his possession. Copies had already been made and secured elsewhere. If anything happened to the folder or to him, the entire record would be released. That statement introduced a different kind of fear into the room. The cardinals understood that the confrontation had not been prepared in haste and that the Pope had anticipated the possibility of resistance after the meeting. The evidence could not be destroyed by removing one folder or isolating one witness. The operation against his reforms had been documented beyond their reach. Several cardinals began wondering how long he had known. They considered whether he had discovered the plan only during the flight home or whether he had boarded the aircraft to Algeria, already aware that they might move during his absence. None of them could determine whether the journey had created the opportunity or merely exposed men. The Pope was already watching. No one dared to ask. Pope Leo XIV then stood and walked slowly along the length of the table. He passed each cardinal without touching him or offering any explanation. At the third chair from the end, he stopped and placed one hand on the back of the chair. The man seated there looked up. The Pope identified him as the author of the April 16th memorandum. He stated that the cardinal had drafted the language, carried it to the others, and explained why the financial audit should be delayed. He had persuaded two of his brothers that the delay represented the wiser course. The cardinal remained silent because the accusation left no uncertain detail to deny. Pope Leo XIV told him that the drafting metadata, document trail, electronic exchanges, and witness testimony were already secured. There was no path out of the conversation that did not pass through honesty. The Pope did not demand a confession with anger. He simply removed every possible exit except the truth. The cardinal lowered his head and admitted that he had written the April 16th memorandum. He said the group believed the reforms were moving too quickly and that Pope Leo XIV did not yet understand the institution. Some of them, he added, believed the Church needed protection from change as much as it needed change. The Pope listened without interrupting. He thanked the cardinal for the first honest answer of the night and acknowledged that some change could be reckless. But the Church, he said, did not need protection from accountability, transparency, or the faithful knowing how their gifts were spent and how their suffering was handled. The men in that room had not protected the Church. They had protected themselves. Pope Leo XIV returned to his chair and announced what would happen next. The financial audit would be accelerated, and the lay auditors would arrive in Rome on the second Monday of May with unrestricted access to every department, account, contract, and sealed file connected to the review. No office would receive an exemption or additional time. The accountability protocol for bishops accused of covering up abuse would be formalized through a papal decree issued on the Pope's own initiative within 3 weeks. The text was complete and would no longer be delayed. The structural redistribution would also proceed in binding phases, and the first 3 affected offices would be named publicly. The Pope then informed the cardinals that none of them would remain in those 3 offices when the announcement was made. 3 men understood that their careers in Rome had effectively ended. Before they could absorb the decision, he revealed that one of the 12 would be appointed to lead the new Office of Internal Compliance the following morning. The move destroyed the unity of the group. They had entered the room as a coalition, but they would leave as 12 individuals, each uncertain who had been marked for trust and who had been marked for removal. The Pope had divided them without demanding accusations or public confessions. He told them the decisions were not punishment and not revenge. His concern was a church that would not fail another generation. He spoke of the prisoners in Bata who had prayed in the rain, the women who had lost children to violence, the priests abandoned after telling the truth, and the young people who had left because they believed church leaders were liars. Every one of those people, he said, deserved better than what had happened during his 11 days in Africa. Then Pope Leo XIV rose and walked to the door. He ordered the cardinals to continue their public duties, but they were not to telephone, write to, or meet one another. His final instruction was simple. They would pray, and they would pray especially in the days ahead. Then he wished them good night and left the room. The 12 cardinals remained in the side hall for almost 10 minutes after Pope Leo XIV left. None of them spoke as they rose one by one, crossed the corridor, and departed the apostolic palace in separate cars. By 1:42 in the morning, the room was empty, the lights were off, and the door had been locked. Within 24 hours, the three decisions announced that night began moving through the Vatican. The accountability protocol for bishops accused of covering up abuse was prepared for signature. The lay auditors were confirmed for arrival the following week, and the new Office of Internal Compliance was announced. The cardinal marked trust in the Black Notebook was chosen to lead it. Within 72 hours, 4 cardinals requested early retirement, and 2 were reassigned far from Rome. 3 received written warnings, while 2 others, including the author of the April 16th memorandum, entered 6-month reviews and lost their signing authority. The coalition that had acted during the Pope's absence was dismantled without a public scandal. The meeting never officially leaked. No names appeared in the press, no transcript emerged, and no photograph existed. Yet the Roman Curia changed almost immediately. Documents began moving faster, delayed files were closed, and officials started reading more carefully before signing. Conversations became shorter, working hours grew longer, and men who had remained silent began examining their own responsibility. The meeting involved 12 cardinals, but its pressure reached hundreds. One senior cardinal said the Pope saw more than they had believed. Another said they had misunderstood what he was waiting for. A third admitted the central mistake. They had confused his silence with his absence. Several days later, an aide entered the Pope's private apartment with the morning briefing. The black leather notebook lay open beside a fresh page containing one sentence: "The Church would not hide any more." Beneath it, underlined twice, was the instruction that defined what came next: "Begin again tomorrow."